The Astral Symphony was the pride of the Galactic Confederation's diplomatic fleet. Its crystalline spires and iridescent hull spoke of technological mastery that spanned 17 sapient species across 12 star systems. Today, however, the ship's pristine reputation was about to face its greatest test. Chief Engineer Sarah Chen stood in the central control hub, her dark eyes fixed on readings that shouldn't have been possible. The ship's environmental systems were failing across all decks simultaneously. Around her, the alien crew members were already showing signs of distress. The Valuri's normally flowing tentacles had become rigid, while the crystalline Zarkax representatives were developing a concerning cloudy texture to their usually transparent forms. "Impossible," muttered First Officer Tal, his scaled skin flushing a deeper shade of blue. "All 7 redundant systems failing at once? The probability is—" "Save the math," Sarah interrupted, her fingers dancing across the holographic controls. "We have 800 passengers, and most of them can't handle temperature variations of more than 2 degrees. We're already past that mark." The massive cruise ship had been chosen for this diplomatic mission precisely because of its legendary reliability. Representatives from all Confederation species were aboard, gathering for the first time to discuss humanity's petition for full membership. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The only human crew member aboard was now responsible for preventing a disaster that could doom Earth's application before the talks even began. Tal's head frills twitched with agitation. "The Mersian delegation is already reporting respiratory distress. They're methane-based biology." "I know," Sarah cut in, wiping sweat from her forehead. The temperature was rising faster than expected, already pushing 30 degrees Celsius. For her, it was merely uncomfortable. For many of the passengers, it would soon become lethal. The ship's AI chimed in, its voice carefully modulated to project calm. "Environmental systems continuing to degrade. Estimated time to critical failure, 47 minutes. Sarah knew what that meant. In less than an hour, the carefully maintained atmosphere aboard the Astral Symphony would become incompatible with life for most of its passengers. The Confederation prided itself on its environmental control technology. It was the foundation that allowed such diverse species to coexist in shared spaces. "We should begin evacuation procedures," Tal suggested, his normally precise voice wavering. "The nearest Confederation outpost is 6 days away at maximum speed," Sarah finished. "And we don't have enough emergency pods for everyone." She pulled up the ship's schematics, examining the complex network of environmental control systems. "Something's wrong with this failure pattern. It's too perfect." The ship's massive system of temperature regulation, atmosphere processing, and pressure control was designed with multiple redundancies. Each backup was different by design, using varying technologies to prevent any single point of failure. Yet somehow, they were all failing in sequence, like dominoes falling in a predetermined pattern. Sabotage. Tal's scales shifted to a pale gray, the equivalent of a human going white with shock. Sarah nodded grimly. "Has to be. But that's actually good news." She was already moving toward the engineering access shaft, her mind racing through possibilities. "If it's deliberate, there's a pattern. If there's a pattern, we can fight it." The first officer's translator took a moment to process her idiom, but his confusion was clear. "Fight? Engineer Chen, this is a technical problem requiring a technical solution. Perhaps if we consult the Zarkax engineers." "With respect, sir, we don't have time for a committee." The temperature had risen another degree during their brief conversation. The Zarkax are brilliant engineers, but they're already struggling to think clearly in this heat. Their crystalline neural pathways are sensitive to thermal variations. As if to prove her point, a group of Zarkax engineers hurried past, their normally graceful movements turned sluggish and uncoordinated. Their transparent bodies had taken on a worrying opacity, a sign their biological processes were already being affected by the heat. Sarah pulled open the access panel, revealing the cramped maintenance shaft beyond. The heat hit her like a physical wall. The environmental systems might be failing throughout the ship, but here in the engineering spaces, temperatures were already approaching dangerous levels. "You can't go in there," Tal protested. "The safety protocols are based on Confederation species limitations," Sarah finished. "But I'm human. We evolved on a planet with seasonal temperature swings of over 50 degrees. Our ancestors survived ice ages and equatorial summers. This?" She managed a grim smile. "This is just a hot day in Singapore." Before Tal could protest further, Sarah swung herself into the shaft. The metal was hot enough to be uncomfortable against her palms, but not unbearable. "Not yet." "Engineer Chen," Tal called after her, his translator struggling to convey the mix of concern and confusion in his voice. "What are you planning to do?" Sarah paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Something inappropriate, probably. Inform the captain that I'm implementing emergency protocol HC-17. There is no protocol HC-17 in the ship's database." "Exactly." Sarah grinned. HC stands for human creativity. Sometimes the best solutions aren't in any manual. As she crawled deeper into the ship's maintenance system, Sarah could hear the growing chaos above. The Confederation prided itself on its technological sophistication, its carefully regulated environments, its precise control over every variable. But sometimes, she thought, the most sophisticated solution was remembering how to survive when all that control went away. She had 45 minutes to save 800 lives, prevent a diplomatic disaster, and prove that humanity's primitive adaptability was exactly what the Confederation needed. The temperature continued to rise, but Sarah Chen smiled. After all, humans had a long history of performing their best under pressure. The ship's AI spoke again, its tone still carefully neutral. "Warning. Temperature in engineering sectors now exceeding safety parameters for all known Confederation species." "Good thing I'm not a Confederation species yet," Sarah muttered, pulling herself deeper into the heart of the dying ship. Sometimes being primitive has its advantages. Around her, the Astral Symphony's environmental systems continued their calculated descent into chaos, but Sarah had already stopped paying attention to the warning signals. She was too busy remembering everything she knew about keeping cool without technology, lessons learned from Earth's long history before environmental control became a science. The most sophisticated beings in the galaxy were about to get a crash course in survival from their primitive cousins. And Sarah had a feeling this would be one diplomatic mission the Confederation wouldn't soon forget. The maintenance shaft felt like a sauna as Sarah crawled deeper into the Astral Symphony's infrastructure. Sweat dripped from her face onto the metal panels below, instantly evaporating in the rising heat. The ship's sophisticated environmental systems surrounded her, beautiful examples of engineering now turned treacherous. At a junction point, she paused to examine a primary control node. The crystalline matrix that regulated temperature distribution was intact, but the readings were nonsense. It was as if the system thought it was maintaining perfect conditions while actually doing the opposite. "Chin to bridge," she called out, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Captain, I'm seeing something strange in the programming. The systems think they're working perfectly." Captain Vextal's voice crackled through her communicator, the usual musical tones of his species strained. "Explain." "It's like..." Sarah searched for an analogy they would understand. "Like someone convinced the ship it's freezing when it's actually burning up. The systems are working harder to heat rather than cool, and they've locked out all manual overrides." A new voice joined the conversation, Ambassador Ixil of the Zarkax, their tone sharp despite their deteriorating condition. "Impossible. Our environmental control systems are beyond such primitive manipulations. The fail-safes have failed," Sarah interrupted, wiping more sweat from her eyes. "Someone knew exactly how your fail-safes work. They didn't break them, they fooled them." She could almost feel the shock rippling through the bridge. The Confederation's technological superiority was an article of faith, especially among the Zarkaks. The idea that their systems could be so thoroughly compromised was almost heretical. The temperature readout on her toolkit showed 35 degrees Celsius and climbing. For most of the passengers, these conditions were already dangerous. She could hear the strain in the captain's voice as he spoke again. The Mersian delegation has lost consciousness. Medical teams are struggling to maintain their methane atmosphere tanks. Engineer Chen, if you have a solution, we need it now. Sarah had reached the central processing core, a massive chamber filled with crystalline computational matrices, the artificial brain that regulated every aspect of the ship's environment. In normal conditions, the room would have been sterile, maintained at precise temperatures by multiple redundant systems. Now it was a furnace. I found it, she announced, examining the core's access panels. The saboteur inserted a cascading logic bomb. It's elegant, actually. It uses the system's own safety protocols against themselves. When one system detects others failing, it tries to compensate, but the compensation is based on false readings, which makes things worse. Can you correct it? The captain's question was direct. Sarah laughed grimly. Not quickly enough. The code is too deeply embedded. But. She paused, an idea forming. But maybe we don't have to. Explain, several voices demanded simultaneously. The ship's systems are too sophisticated to fix quickly, Sarah said, already pulling tools from her belt. So let's go primitive instead. Captain, I need you to shut down all power to the environmental systems. The silence that followed was deafening. That would be suicide, Ambassador Ixel protested. Without environmental control. Without environmental control, we can start from scratch, Sarah interrupted. Sometimes you have to turn everything off and back on again. But first, I need to set up something my ancestors used before we had climate control. She was already working as she spoke, pulling apart panels and rerouting connections. The ship's designers had never intended for these systems to be modified this way, but desperate times called for desperate measures. What are you doing? The captain's voice was tense. Creating a convection cooling system, Sarah explained, her hands moving quickly despite the oppressive heat. The saboteur controlled our active cooling systems, but they can't control basic physics. Heat rises. Cold air sinks. If we create the right airflow pattern. Primitive thermodynamics. The ambassador's tone was somewhere between horrified and fascinated. You want to entrust our lives to natural air movement? Exactly. Sarah grinned despite the situation. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Captain, I'm going to need access to the water recycling systems too. We're going to create the galaxy's biggest swamp cooler. She could practically hear the alien crew members searching their translation databases for the term swamp cooler. Before they could object, she continued. I've rerouted emergency power to create artificial pressure gradients. When you cut main power to the environmental systems, these will create a natural airflow pattern through the ship. Combined with evaporative cooling from the recycling system's water supply. It could work, a new voice chimed in, one of the Valuri engineers, their tentacles writhing with excitement. The principles are archaic, but sound. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The Valuri were known for their practical approach to problems, unlike the more technologically conservative Zarkaks. It's not elegant, she admitted, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to keep us alive until we can purge the saboteur's code and restore proper systems. The temperature had climbed another degree during their conversation. Warning signals were flashing across every deck, and Sarah could hear the growing distress in the background communications. Captain, she said, her voice firm. We're out of options and almost out of time. Trust me. There was a moment of tense silence, broken only by the sound of failing systems and Sarah's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Proceed, Captain Vextal ordered finally. All decks, prepare for environmental system shutdown. Medical teams, stand by. Engineer Chen, make your primitive solution work. Sarah took a deep breath of the superheated air. Shutting down in 3, 2, 1. The sophisticated environmental systems of the Astral Symphony, pride of the Confederation fleet, went dark. In their place, Sarah Chen prepared to demonstrate why humanity's primitive solutions had kept them alive through ice ages, heat waves, and everything in between. As darkness fell in the processing core, she whispered a phrase her grandmother had often used, "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Now she just had to prove it to the most technologically advanced species in known space. The Astral Symphony hung in space, its environmental systems dark for the first time since its maiden voyage. In the processing core, Sarah Chen worked with desperate speed, her movements precise despite the suffocating heat. The ship's internal temperature had reached 38 degrees Celsius, dangerous territory for most of the alien passengers. Recycling systems diverted, she reported, connecting the last makeshift conduit. Beginning water dispersion now. What she'd created would have made any ancient desert dweller proud. Using the ship's own architecture, she'd established convection currents that would carry hot air upward through the vessel's spine. Strategic placement of water vapor would cool the air as it descended back through the passenger decks, a massive version of technologies humans had used for millennia. Engineer Chen, Captain Vextal's voice was weaker now, the heat affecting even his resistant species. The Mersian delegation's life support is critical. Their containment units are overheating. Sarah's hands froze for a moment. The Mersians. In her focus on the overall cooling system, she'd almost forgotten about their special needs. The methane-breathing species required separate environmental units, which were now failing without main power. Understood, she replied, already modifying her plans. Captain, I need every able-bodied crew member to gather all available ice from the ship's food storage facilities. Have them focus on the Mersian quarters first. Ice? Ambassador Ixel's voice was incredulous despite their obvious distress. You want to fight a ship-wide environmental crisis with frozen water? Exactly. Sarah was already climbing through the access shaft toward the nearest storage area. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. The Mersians need more than atmospheric cooling, they need thermal mass to stabilize their environment. She emerged into a corridor filled with disoriented crew members. The Zarkak's representatives had lost their crystalline transparency entirely, their forms now clouded and sluggish. The Valuri's tentacles moved erratically, their usual fluid grace replaced by jerky desperation. Follow me, she ordered, surprising herself with her tone of authority. These beings represented some of the most advanced civilizations in known space, yet here they were, following a human's primitive leadership. The storage units were exactly where she needed them. Form a chain, she commanded. We need to move this ice quickly before it melts. As they worked, Sarah felt the first effects of her makeshift cooling system. The convection currents were starting to flow, carrying the worst of the heat upward. The water vapor was beginning to create a cooling effect, slight but noticeable. Temperature dropping in sections 12 through 15, the ship's AI reported. 0.5 degrees and accelerating. A ragged cheer went up from the crew members, cut short by another urgent call from the bridge. Engineer Chen, Captain Vextal's voice was tight with concern. We're detecting unauthorized access to the auxiliary control systems. Someone is attempting to override your modifications. The saboteur. Sarah's mind raced. Of course they wouldn't give up so easily. Location. Auxiliary Control Room 3, Deck 7. Understood. Sarah turned to the crew members around her. Continue with the ice distribution. Focus on critical areas first, Mersian quarters, medical bay, nursery sections. She was moving before anyone could object, her feet carrying her toward Deck 7. The heat was less oppressive now, her makeshift cooling system doing its job, but she knew it was only a temporary solution. If the saboteur regained control of the environmental systems, all her work would be undone in minutes. The access shaft to Deck 7 was narrow and steep. As she climbed, Sarah's mind worked through the implications. The saboteur had to be someone with deep knowledge of Confederation systems, someone who could move freely through the ship without arousing suspicion. She emerged into a dimly lit corridor. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow, creating strange shadows. Ahead, she could see the door to Auxiliary Control Room 3. Bridge, she whispered into her communicator. Any life signs in the control room? 1, the captain replied. Species reading is unclear. The heat is interfering with our sensors. Sarah approached carefully. Through the door's small window, she could see a figure working at the control panel. Their movements were precise, professional, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She took a deep breath. The temperature was starting to rise again. Whatever she was going to do, it had to be soon. The door slid open with a soft hiss. The figure at the control panel turned, and Sarah felt her breath catch. The being before her was neither Zarkax nor Valuri nor any other Confederation species she recognized. Its form seemed to shift and flow, adapting to the heat rather than suffering from it. Interesting solution, the being said, its voice modulated and artificial. Primitive, yet effective. You humans always did have a remarkable talent for survival. Sarah's mind raced. The figure before her wasn't just a saboteur, it was something entirely unknown, something that had infiltrated the Confederation's most secure vessel. Who are you? She demanded, taking a careful step forward. The being's form rippled. Consider me a test, Engineer Chen. The Confederation needed to understand what humanity truly offers. Are you merely another technological species, or are you something more interesting? Behind her, Sarah could hear running footsteps, security forces responding to her location. But she knew that in the next few moments, before help arrived, she would have to make a choice that could affect not just the ship, but humanity's entire future in the galaxy. The temperature was rising again. Time was running out. And Sarah Chen, facing an unknown being with unknown capabilities, had to decide whether to fight, negotiate, or try something entirely unexpected, something primitively human. The galaxy was watching. And humanity's representative was about to make her move. The auxiliary control room had become an arena where two fundamentally different approaches to survival faced off. Sarah Chen stood her ground, sweat rolling down her temples, as she studied the shifting form before her. A test, she repeated, her mind working through the implications. You endangered 800 lives to test humanity's worth. The being's form rippled again, almost apologetically. The Confederation's advancement has become stagnant. They solve every problem with technology, becoming more dependent with each solution. We needed to know if humanity would follow the same path. Sarah's laugh was sharp and sudden. So you created a crisis that technology couldn't solve. Clever. She took another step forward, noting how the being's form remained stable despite the heat that was now approaching 40 degrees Celsius. But you made one crucial mistake. Oh. The being's tone was curious. You assumed there were only two options, technological sophistication or primitive survival. Sarah's hand moved slowly toward the environmental control panel. Humanity's strength isn't in choosing one or the other. It's in knowing when to use both. In one fluid motion, she slammed her hand down on the emergency purge button, a manual override that would flood the auxiliary control room with fire-suppressant foam. The being's form wavered in surprise as white clouds billowed from the ceiling. Primitive enough for you? Sarah grinned, then activated her communicator. Bridge, now. The ship's AI responded instantly to her prearranged signal. Power surged through the newly configured systems she'd spent the last hour setting up. The makeshift convection currents she'd established suddenly intensified, driven now by emergency power rather than mere thermodynamics. The being's form began to distort in the chaos of foam and shifting air currents. Impressive. Using both emergency systems and natural principles. And good old-fashioned distraction, Sarah added, pulling a small device from her pocket, a manual temperature regulator she'd reconfigured while setting up her cooling system. While you were focusing on my primitive solution, I was actually setting up something a bit more sophisticated. The regulator emitted a focused burst of energy, creating a localized zone of intense cold around the being. Its form began to crystallize, movements becoming sluggish. You see, Sarah continued, advancing steadily, humans didn't survive on Earth by being primitive or advanced. We survived by being adaptable. By using every tool available, whether it was fire, ice, or quantum mechanics. Security forces burst into the room, led by First Officer Tull. They surrounded the now semi-frozen being, whose form had settled into a more solid state. The ship's temperature is stabilizing, Tull reported, his scales returning to their normal hue. Your cooling system, combined with the emergency power redistribution, is bringing conditions back to acceptable levels. Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes on the captured being. Have the immersions been stabilized? Yes. The ice application was, surprisingly effective. The being's voice had taken on a new tone, something almost like respect. You knew I would expect either a technological solution or a primitive one. So you provided both, knowing I would underestimate at least one approach. Actually, Sarah corrected, I provided about 5 different solutions, knowing you'd probably counter at least 3 of them. Humans don't believe in single points of failure, or single points of success. Captain Vextal's voice came through the communicator, stronger now as the ship's environment normalized. Engineer Chen, we're detecting unusual energy readings from our guest. Recommend immediate containment protocols. The being's form began to glow softly. That won't be necessary, Captain. The test is complete, and the results are enlightening. Sarah tensed, but the being made no aggressive moves. Instead, its form began to shift into something more defined, a humanoid shape with features that seemed to blend aspects of various Confederation species. I represent a group that has long observed the Confederation's development, it explained. We were concerned about humanity's admission. Your species' history of conflict, your seemingly chaotic approach to problem solving, some feared you would destabilize the careful order that has been established. And now? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Now we understand that chaos and order are not opposites, but complementary forces. Your solution to this crisis demonstrated something the Confederation has been lacking, the ability to embrace both tradition and innovation, to combine the primitive with the sophisticated. The security forces maintained their positions, but Sarah could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. This hadn't just been about testing humanity's capabilities, it had been about challenging the Confederation's assumptions about progress itself. So, Sarah said, wiping the last of the sweat from her forehead, did we pass? The being's form stabilized further, taking on an almost diplomatic posture. Engineer Chen, I believe you have done more than pass. You have opened a dialogue that the Confederation desperately needed to have with itself. Around them, the Astral Symphony's systems were returning to normal. The sophisticated environmental controls were coming back online, integrating seamlessly with Sarah's improvised solutions. It was, she realized, a perfect metaphor for what humanity could offer the Confederation, not just new technology or primitive wisdom, but the ability to bridge the gap between the two. First Officer Tull stepped forward, his scales now showing the blue-green pattern of deep thought. Perhaps, he said slowly, we have all been tested today. And perhaps we all had something to learn. Sarah looked around the room, at the sophisticated control panels covered in fire suppression foam, at the jury-rigged cooling system that had saved hundreds of lives, at the being who had orchestrated this elaborate test. She thought about humanity's long history of facing challenges, of surviving not through perfection but through endless adaptation. That's the thing about tests, she said with a smile. The best ones teach something to everyone involved. The being nodded, its form now completely stabilized. Indeed. And I believe the real lessons are just beginning. 3 days after the environmental crisis, the Astral Symphony's Grand Conference Hall hosted a very different kind of diplomatic meeting than originally planned. Sarah Chen sat at the center table, still somewhat uncomfortable with the attention focused on her. Around the room, representatives from every Confederation species gathered, their expressions and postures reflecting a mix of curiosity, respect, and lingering unease. The being who had orchestrated the test, now introducing itself as Observer Zenth from the Custodian Assembly, stood at the podium. Its form had settled into a permanent state that somehow managed to look both ancient and timeless. For 10,000 years, Zenth began, the Confederation has grown through technological advancement. Each new species brought its own innovations, its own sophisticated solutions. But somewhere along this path, we began to forget something crucial, the value of versatility. Sarah watched the reactions around the room. The Zarkax representatives, their crystalline forms now fully restored, shifted uncomfortably. The Voluri's tentacles moved in patterns indicating deep thought. Even the Mersians, safely contained in their atmospheric suits, seemed to lean forward with interest. Engineer Chen's response to our test demonstrated something we had not anticipated, Zenth continued. When faced with a crisis that defeated advanced technology, she did not simply revert to primitive methods. Instead, she created a synthesis, a harmony between the old and the new. Captain Vextalf stood, his scales shimmering with formal patterns. The ship's engineers have studied the solutions implemented during the crisis. The combination of basic thermodynamic principles with our existing systems has led to several innovations in emergency protocols. Sarah couldn't help but smile. The Confederation engineers had been particularly fascinated by her primitive convection system. They'd already begun developing hybrid backup systems that could function even with total power loss. But perhaps more significant, the captain continued, is what this incident reveals about humanity's potential contribution to the Confederation. Ambassador Ixil raised their now clear crystalline form. Some of us had concerns about humanity's unpredictable nature. Their tendency to solve problems in unorthodox ways seemed at odds with Confederation protocols. And now? Sarah asked, speaking for the first time during the meeting. The ambassador's form sparkled, their species equivalent of a thoughtful smile. Now we understand that this very unpredictability might be exactly what the Confederation needs. Your species' ability to bridge the gap between instinct and innovation, between the primitive and the sophisticated, offers something unique. Zenth nodded approvingly. The Custodian Assembly has observed many civilizations over the millennia. Those that survive, truly survive, are not the ones with the most advanced technology or the strongest connection to their primitive roots. It is those who can draw upon both, who can adapt and combine different approaches. First Officer Tal stepped forward, his scales now bearing the formal markings of an official pronouncement. In light of recent events, the Confederation Council has reached a unanimous decision regarding Earth's petition for membership. Sarah sat straighter, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her actions during the crisis, it was about humanity's place in the galaxy. Humanity, Tal announced, will be granted full membership in the Confederation, effective immediately. Furthermore, we are establishing a new division within our engineering corps, focused on adaptive solutions and emergency protocols. Engineer Chen, we would be honored if you would consider leading this initiative. The room erupted in the various sounds and gestures of approval from multiple species. Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with environmental systems. I would be honored, she said, then added with a smile, as long as we can keep some of those primitive backup systems in place. Laughter rippled through the room, a harmony of different sounds united in understanding. Later, as the formal proceedings wound down, Sarah found herself standing with Zenth near one of the ship's massive observation windows. The stars beyond seemed to shine with new possibility. "You know," she said, "your test was incredibly dangerous. A lot of things could have gone wrong." Zentha's form rippled slightly. "Yes. But we had studied humanity extensively. We were confident that under sufficient pressure, your species would demonstrate its true strength. Which is the ability to remind the galaxy that progress isn't always about moving forward. Sometimes it's about remembering where you've been, and finding new ways to bring the past and future together." Sarah thought about the modifications being made to the Astral Symphony systems, sophisticated environmental controls now backed up by simple thermodynamic principles. Ancient wisdom enhanced by modern technology. Human ingenuity bridging the gap between extremes. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now." Zentha's form shifted to catch the starlight. "Now humanity joins the Confederation not as students of advanced technology, but as teachers of adaptation. Your species will help us remember that the path forward isn't always a straight line." Sarah nodded, watching the stars. Humanity had finally found its place in the galaxy, not by becoming more like the advanced species of the Confederation, but by showing them the value of being more like humans. "You know," she said with a grin, "Earth has a saying, everything old is new again." Zentha's form sparkled with amusement. How appropriately human, finding wisdom in paradox. As the Astral Symphony continued its journey through space, its environmental systems hummed with a new harmony of old and new, primitive and advanced, human and alien. It was, Sarah reflected, exactly the kind of paradox that humanity did best. And somewhere in the vastness of space, other civilizations waited to learn what happens when you combine the wisdom of the past with the technology of the future, guided by the uniquely human ability to make the impossible seem inevitable. The temperature in the ship remained perfect, maintained by both the most advanced technology in the galaxy and the simple principles that had kept humans alive since they first looked up at the stars and dreamed of reaching them.